Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, where gods wage war across the stars and entire worlds burn in the fires of endless conflict, there exists a name that echoes through 10,000 years of imperial history. Not a Primarch, not a space marine, not even one of the genetically enhanced warriors who stride across battlefields like demigods made flesh. No, this name belongs to an old man, hunched and wizened, who wielded no chainsword and commanded no legion. Yet without him, the Imperium of Man would never have existed at all. His name was Malcador. Malcador the Sigillite, Malcador the hero, and this is his story. When we think of the Emperor's inner circle during the birth of the Imperium, our minds naturally drift to the Golden Giants, the 20 Primarchs scattered across the galaxy, and eventually reunited with their father. We think of Constantin Valdor, the first and greatest of the Custodian Guard, a warrior without peer. We think of the Thunder Warriors who conquered Terra, or the first Space Marines who would carry the Great Crusade to the stars. These are the names carved into monuments, celebrated in imperial propaganda, remembered in the prayers of the faithful. But before all of them, there was Malcador. He was there at the very beginning, when the Emperor was just another warlord among the techno-barbarian kings who carved up the wasteland of Terra. He was there during the Unification Wars, when humanity's homeworld was finally brought under one banner after millennia of division. He was there during the Great Crusade, managing the day-to-day administration of an empire that spanned millions of worlds. He was there during the Council of Nicaea, when the fate of psychic powers within the Imperium hung in the balance. He was there when the Horus Heresy tore the galaxy apart, working tirelessly in the shadows to preserve what could be saved. And he was there at the end, when the siege of Terra reached its terrible climax, making a sacrifice that would echo through the ages. The curious thing about Malcador is how little we truly know about him. For a figure of such monumental importance, he remains shrouded in mystery. His origins are uncertain. His true age is staggering. His powers, while clearly immense, were never fully revealed. He preferred to work behind the scenes, content to let others take the glory while he shaped the Imperium from the shadows. In a universe of bombastic heroes and larger-than-life villains, Malcador was something different. He was the trusted advisor, the patient administrator, the friend who stood by the Emperor's side when everyone else was either a subject or a son. By the time of the Horus Heresy, Malcador was over 6,700 years old. Think about that for a moment. 6 millennia and more, watching civilizations rise and fall, witnessing the age of strife tear humanity's first stellar empire apart, surviving the long darkness that followed. He could remember his own date of birth to the second, a clarity of memory that speaks to something far beyond normal human capability. He had seen the worst that old night could offer, and yet he never lost faith that humanity could rise again. Malcador held many titles throughout his long service. He was the first Lord of Terra, the Emperor's regent who governed the throne world when his master was away prosecuting the Great Crusade. He was the Grand Master of Assassins, secretly overseeing the Officio Assassinorum and its deadly operatives. He was the founder of what would become the Administratum, creating the vast bureaucratic machinery that would keep the Imperium functioning across impossible distances. He was the man who presided over the Council of Nicaea, delivering the chaplain edict that would create a new order within the Space Marine legions. He was the founder of the Inquisition, gathering together individuals who would root out heresy and treason. He was the father of the Grey Knights, selecting and training the warriors who would stand against the demonic. But perhaps his most important title was simply this: friend. The relationship between Malcador and the Emperor is one of the most fascinating dynamics in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. These were not master and servant, though Malcador certainly served. These were not god and worshipper, though Malcador revered the Emperor's vision. These were two ancient beings who had known each other for centuries, who had planned and schemed and built an empire together, who trusted each other with secrets that no one else could know. When they spoke, there was a familiarity there, a warmth even, that the emperor shared with almost no one else. While others called him the master of mankind and prostrated themselves before his glory, Malcador could sit across a regicide board from him and challenge his decisions. While others saw the emperor as an inhuman force of nature, yet Malcador knew the man beneath the myth. And in the end, when everything hung in the balance and the Imperium teetered on the edge of extinction, Malcador would make the ultimate sacrifice to give his oldest friend one final chance to save humanity. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To truly understand Malcador and appreciate the magnitude of what he accomplished, we need to go back, way back before the Imperium, before the Unification Wars, before the Emperor revealed himself to the masses. Back to a time when terror was a dying world and a secret order worked to preserve the last remnants of humanity's greatness. Back to the Sigillites. The Age of Strife was perhaps the darkest period in human history. For 5,000 years, the galaxy burned. The birth pangs of Slanesh, the youngest of the Chaos Gods, and created warp storms that made interstellar travel impossible. Human colonies were cut off from each other, isolated and alone. Some thrived. Most didn't. On thousands of worlds, civilization collapsed. Technology was lost. Knowledge was forgotten. Humanity, which had once built an empire among the stars during the dark age of technology, was reduced to scattered pockets of survivors clinging to existence. On Terra itself, the situation was particularly grim. The cradle of humanity had become a nightmare landscape of warring techno-barbarian states, each one ruled by warlords who commanded armies enhanced by crude genetic modification and forgotten technologies they barely understood. The planet's ecosystem was thoroughly wrecked, its surface scarred by millennia of war and industrial exploitation. The oceans had become toxic sludge. The atmosphere was choked with pollution. Great hive cities rose like tumors from the devastated landscape, their populations living in squalor while their rulers fought endless wars for dominance. It was a world that had forgotten its own history. The glories of the dark age of technology, when humanity had created wonders that would seem like magic to later generations, were lost to myth and legend. The sophisticated interstellar civilization that had once connected Terra to millions of colony worlds was nothing but a half-remembered dream. Even basic literacy was rare outside the ruling classes. Knowledge had become a weapon, hoarded by those in power and denied to the masses. But there were those who remembered, those who understood what had been lost, and who dedicated themselves to preserving it for a future generation that might rebuild. They called themselves the Sigillites. The Sigillites were an ancient and highly secretive organization that predated even the Age of Strife. They had existed during the dark age of technology and had somehow survived the long collapse that followed. Their purpose was singular and vital: to gather and preserve the greatest cultural artifacts of humanity's past. Ancient weapons technologies that could no longer be replicated. Works of art that represented the pinnacle of human creativity. Scientific knowledge that had taken millennia to accumulate. Historical records that documented humanity's rise to galactic prominence. All of these things the Sigillites collected, protected, and hid away in their fortress deep in the Himalayan mountains. But the fortress itself was a marvel. Built into the bones of the ancient mountain range, it was more than just a stronghold. It was a library, a museum, a vault of everything that made humanity great. Its halls contained treasures that would have been priceless in any era. Original manuscripts from old Earth's greatest philosophers, technological schematics from the height of human achievement, genetic samples from Terra before its ecosystem collapsed, weapons that could level cities, art that could move even the most hardened warrior to tears. The Sigillites understood that knowledge was humanity's greatest asset, and that without it, the species would never recover from the darkness that had engulfed it. But being a Sigillite was more than just being a librarian or a museum curator. These were dangerous times, and the artifacts they protected were coveted by warlords and tyrants who would use them for conquest rather than enlightenment. The Sigillites had to be warriors as well as scholars, capable of defending their treasures against those who would steal or destroy them. They were also psychers, many of them, blessed and cursed with powers that allowed them to see beyond the veil of reality. In an age where psychic powers were poorly understood and often led to madness or demonic possession, the Sigillites had developed methods to train and control these abilities. And among the Sigillites, there was one who stood above all others. His birth name was Malcador, though in time he would take on another name entirely. He was old, even by Sigillite standards, his life extending far beyond what any normal human could expect. While he was a perpetual, one of those rare individuals who simply did not age and could not die by normal means. Where others grew old and passed away, he remained, century after century, accumulating knowledge and wisdom that no mortal lifespan could contain. By his own reckoning, he had lived through the glory days of the dark age of technology. He had witnessed the collapse of humanity's first empire. He had survived the worst of the age of strife. He had seen civilizations rise and fall, seen technologies that would seem like sorcery to later generations, seen horrors that would drive lesser minds to madness. And through it all, he had remained true to the Sigillite mission: preserve the past so that the future might learn from it. But the age of strife took its toll on even the Sigillites, one by one. The members of the Order died or disappeared. Their numbers dwindled as the wars on terror intensified, and the dangers of the warp grew ever more pronounced. By the late 29th millennium, the Order was all but extinct. The fortress remained, hidden in the mountains, but those who guarded it were few, and Malcador began to suspect that he might be the last of his kind, the final guardian of humanity's lost heritage. It was around this time that he encountered another perpetual, another ancient being who had walked Terra's surface for longer than recorded history. This individual was moving through the chaos of the age of strife with purpose, gathering warriors and resources, building an army from the scattered techno-barbarian tribes. He called himself many things in different languages and to different peoples, but he had a vision that caught Brahm's attention: the unification of Terra under a single ruler, and from there, the reconquest of the stars. Their meeting is shrouded in legend and deliberately obscured even in imperial records. What we know is this: Malcador, last of the Sigillites, went out from his mountain fortress and found a warlord who had dreams of empire. They talked, they debated, they played games of strategy that stretched for days, and in the end, they reached an understanding. The warlord wanted to rebuild humanity's greatness and reclaim the galaxy. Brahm wanted to preserve humanity's heritage and ensure it would never be lost again. Their goals aligned. More than that, they recognized in each other a kindred spirit. As someone who had seen the breadth of human history and understood both its potential and its failures. Here were two immortals who could plan not in terms of years or decades, but in terms of centuries and millennia. Here were two beings who carried the weight of thousands of years of memory and could use that perspective to shape the future. Brahm offered the warlord the Sigillite fortress as a base of operations. It was perfect for the purpose, defensible, hidden, and filled with technology and knowledge that could be used to build an army. The warlord accepted, and in doing so, sealed the fate of the Sigillites as an organization. The ancient order would be subsumed into something new, something grander. But its mission would continue, transformed and expanded beyond anything its founders could have imagined. And Malcador would take on a new name, drawn from the organization he had served for so long. Malcador the Sigillite, the seal-bearer, the keeper of secrets, the one who would speak with the authority of the emperor himself. Because that's what the warlord had become. Malcador suggested the title, and the warlord accepted it. He would no longer be just another tyrant fighting for scraps of a dead world. He would be the emperor of mankind, the master of terror, the being who would unite humanity under one banner and lead it back to the stars. It's worth pausing here to consider the significance of this relationship. The emperor is often portrayed as a being so far beyond human that he might as well be a god. His intellect is incomprehensible. His psychic might is unmatched. While his plans span millennia, and encompass the fate of the entire species. He is so powerful, so brilliant, so far removed from ordinary humanity that it's easy to forget he was ever anything but the master of mankind. But Malcador knew him before all that. Malcador knew him as a warlord among many, as a perpetual like himself, as someone who played regicide and debated philosophy and made mistakes. And that relationship never really changed, even as the Emperor's myth grew and his power became undeniable. To everyone else, he was the Emperor. To Malcador, he was an old friend, a partner in an impossible project, someone he could speak to honestly, without all the ceremony and worship that surrounded the master of mankind. This dynamic would prove crucial in the years to come. The Emperor needed someone who would tell him the truth, who would push back when necessary, who understood his vision well enough to execute it when he was elsewhere. He needed someone who remembered what it was like before the myth of the Emperor, who could help him stay grounded in the reality of what they were trying to accomplish. He needed a friend, not just another subject, and Malcador needed the Emperor just as much. For all his wisdom and knowledge, Malcador was not a conqueror. He was a scholar, an administrator, someone who understood people and systems and the subtle art of governance. He could see the Emperor's vision clearly and believed in it completely, but he could never have achieved it alone. Together, they were unstoppable. Apart, neither could have built what would become the Imperium. So began one of the most important partnerships in human history. The Emperor would be the face of the new empire, the warrior king who led from the front and inspired loyalty through his sheer presence. Malcador would be the hand that shaped policy, the voice that spoke in the Emperor's absence, the administrator who turned grand visions into practical reality. The Emperor would forge the Imperium through conquest. Malcador would maintain it through bureaucracy. And deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, in the ancient fortress that had once belonged to the Sigillites, they would begin their great work. The Unification Wars began in earnest sometime in the late 29th millennium, though the exact dating is unclear, given the chaos of the age. What we know is that the Emperor, now openly claiming that title and backed by an army that grew larger with each victory, began systematically conquering the techno-barbarian nations that divided Terra. These were not easy wars. The warlords of Terra were powerful in their own right, commanding armies of gene-enhanced warriors and wielding technologies scavenged from the Dark Age. Some ruled through sheer brutality and strength of arms. Others were more sophisticated, controlling vast industrial complexes and maintaining something approaching civilization within their borders. A few were even reasonable rulers by the standards of the age, attempting to preserve knowledge and maintain order in a world gone mad. But the Emperor's vision required unity, and unity required conquest. Terra had to be brought under one rule before humanity could reclaim the stars. There could be no rival powers, no independent kingdoms, and no competing visions of what humanity should become. The Emperor offered each nation the same choice: join him willingly and be welcomed into the new Imperium, or resist and be destroyed. Some chose wisely, many didn't. The Thunder Warriors were the Emperor's primary instrument of conquest during these wars. These were the first of his genetically enhanced super soldiers, warriors whose strength and ferocity far exceeded anything the techno-barbarians could field. They were less sophisticated than the Space Marines, who would come later, more unstable and prone to aggression. But for the brutal close-quarters warfare of the Unification Wars, they were perfect. They smashed through enemy lines like a hammer through glass, breaking the back of resistance wherever they appeared. But while the Thunder Warriors were the sword that cut down the Emperor's enemies, Malcador was the voice that convinced many to surrender without a fight. He became the Emperor's chief emissary, traveling to enemy capitals to negotiate terms of compliance. Often, the Emperor would only reveal himself if Malcador's negotiations failed. This was a brilliant strategy. Malcador represented the carrot, the promise of a better future under imperial rule. The Emperor represented the stick, the threat of annihilation if compliance was refused. And Malcador was extraordinarily good at his job. He understood people in a way that even the Emperor sometimes didn't. Where the Emperor saw humanity as a collective to be guided and shaped, Malcador saw individuals with their own motivations, fears, and desires. He could read a room, adjust his approach based on who he was dealing with, find the arguments that would resonate with each particular audience. He was charming when charm was needed, stern when sternness was required, and always utterly convincing. More than that, Malcador genuinely believed in what the Emperor was trying to accomplish. This wasn't just propaganda or political maneuvering. When he spoke of the Emperor's vision for a unified humanity, reclaiming its place among the stars, he spoke with the passion of someone who had seen the alternative. He had lived through the age of strife. He knew what happened when humanity was divided and weak. He understood that unity, even unity achieved through conquest, was preferable to the endless wars that had consumed Terra for millennia. One of the most significant campaigns of the Unification Wars involved the nation of Albia, located in what had once been the British Isles. The Albians were fierce warriors with a strong martial tradition, and they held out against the Emperor's forces longer than almost anyone else. But rather than simply grinding them down through attrition, the Emperor took a different approach. He appeared before the Albion clan lords unarmed, dressed in white and crimson, and spoke to them of his vision. He offered them glory among the stars and redemption for their past conflicts, and remarkably, they accepted. This wasn't just the Emperor's doing. Malcador had been working behind the scenes for years, building relationships with key Albion leaders, planting the seeds of the idea that joining the Emperor was not surrender, but opportunity. When the Emperor finally made his dramatic gesture, the ground had already been prepared. The Albions didn't just submit. They became some of the most zealous supporters of unification, their warriors forming the core of many imperial army regiments. Other conquests were not so bloodless. The techno-barbarian empire of Ursh, ruled by the tyrant Caligan, required years of brutal warfare to subdue. The Ethnarchy, protected by powerful force fields, resisted multiple assaults before finally falling. The region of Gyptus saw terrible battles that left the land even more scarred than it had been before. But slowly, systematically, the Emperor and his armies brought all of Terra under one rule. And everywhere the Emperor's forces went, Malcador followed. Not with armies, but with administrators. Because conquest was only the first step. These newly conquered territories had to be integrated into the growing Imperium. Their populations had to be brought into compliance with imperial law. Their resources had to be assessed and properly utilized. Their rulers, where they could be trusted, had to be given positions in the new order that would satisfy their pride while ensuring their loyalty. This was Malcador's true genius. He wasn't just the Emperor's diplomat, he was the architect of imperial governance. As Terra was unified piece by piece, Malcador was building the administrative infrastructure that would hold it together. He established the Council of Terra, a body of civilian administrators who would govern in the Emperor's name. He created the early version of what would become the Administratum, a vast bureaucratic machine capable of managing an empire. He set up systems for taxation, resource allocation, population management, all the unglamorous but vital work that keeps a civilization functioning. The Emperor trusted Malcador with this work completely, and with good reason. While the Emperor was a visionary and a conqueror, he had little patience for the day-to-day minutiae of governance. His mind was already looking forward to the next challenge, the conquest of the solar system, and eventually the galaxy itself. He needed someone who could handle the boring but necessary work of actually running an empire, someone who shared his vision but was also grounded enough to make it practical. Malcador was that someone, and he approached the task with the same dedication he had once brought to his duties as a sigillite. Just as he had once preserved humanity's heritage, he now built the foundation for humanity's future. Deep beneath the mountains, in laboratories carved from ancient rock, other work was proceeding. The Emperor was working on his greatest creation yet, the Primarchs. These would be beings beyond even the Thunder Warriors or the Space Marines, genetic masterpieces that combined the Emperor's own essence with technologies and knowledge that no one else fully understood. They would be generals to lead his armies, administrators to govern his empire, and sons to carry on his work across the stars. Malcador was one of the very few who knew about this project. He watched as the Emperor labored over his genetic masterworks, pouring decades of effort into creating 20 perfect beings. He offered advice when asked, though much of the science involved was beyond even his considerable knowledge. And he prepared for the day when these Primarchs would take their place at the head of the legions that were being created to house them. And then, disaster struck. The ruinous powers, the dark gods of chaos who dwelt in the warp, reached out and scattered the Primarchs across the galaxy before they could be properly trained and indoctrinated. The Emperor's grand plan suffered a devastating setback. Decades of work seemed to be lost in a single moment. But Malcador didn't despair. He had lived too long and seen too much to be defeated by a single setback, no matter how severe. If the Primarchs were lost, they would be found again. If the plan had to be adjusted, it would be adjusted. The vision remained the same: unite humanity and reclaim the stars. The Unification Wars concluded with the conquest of Terra and the signing of the Treaty of Mars with the Mechanicum. Now the Emperor controlled not just Earth, but also the Red Planet and its vast forges, giving him the industrial capacity to build a truly massive fleet. The stage was set for the next great endeavor, the Great Crusade. And as the Emperor prepared his fleets and armies to reconquer the galaxy, Malcador remained on Terra, doing what he did best, running the Imperium while his friend went to war. The Great Crusade began in the early 31st millennium and would last for 200 years. It was the most ambitious military campaign in human history, seeking nothing less than the reconquest of the entire galaxy. Millions of worlds had to be found, contacted, and brought into compliance with Imperial rule. Alien species that threatened humanity had to be exterminated. Lost human colonies had to be reintegrated into the Imperium. And somewhere out there, scattered across thousands of light years, 20 Primarchs waited to be found. The Emperor led from the front, commanding his fleets and standing alongside his warriors on countless battlefields. He was building his legend, becoming the god figure that later generations would worship. Each victory added to his myth. Each conquered world proved his vision. Each recovered Primarch demonstrated his genius. But while the Emperor was winning glory on the front lines, someone had to actually run the Imperium. And that someone was Malcador. The title he held was Imperial Regent, though that hardly captures the breadth of his responsibilities. When the Emperor was away from Terra, which was almost always during the Great Crusade, Malcador spoke with his full authority. He could make decisions, issue orders, and command obedience from anyone in the Imperium, except the Emperor himself and, arguably, the Primarchs. He was, in effect, the ruler of humanity's greatest empire, even if he preferred to work behind the scenes and let others take the credit. The administrative challenges were staggering in their complexity and scope. The Imperium was growing at an incredible rate, adding new worlds every single day as the Great Crusade pushed deeper into the galaxy. Each world had to be assessed and categorized according to detailed criteria that Malcador himself had developed. Compliant worlds, those that accepted Imperial rule peacefully, had to be integrated into the Imperial tithe system, their resources evaluated and appropriate tribute levels established. Non-compliant worlds had to be marked for military action, prioritized based on strategic importance and the resources required for conquest. Resources had to be allocated across millions of supply lines, spanning incomprehensible distances. Fleets had to be supplied with everything from ammunition to food. Armies had to be raised from newly compliant worlds and trained to Imperial standards. The administratum that Malcador had built on Terra now had to expand across the galaxy, maintaining coherence and efficiency despite the logistical nightmare of managing an empire that grew larger every day. The scale of this undertaking cannot be overstated. Consider what it meant to govern millions of worlds, each with its own culture, language, economy, and challenges. As some worlds were advanced civilizations with sophisticated technology and complex social structures, others were barely out of the Stone Age, their populations living in conditions that would have been familiar to humanity's earliest ancestors. Some had remained loyal to the ideals of the old human empire and welcomed the Imperium with open arms. Others had to be conquered, their resistance crushed, and their populations subjugated. Each required a different approach, different policies, different administrators with different skills. Malcador attacked this challenge with the same methodical brilliance he had brought to the Unification Wars, but on a vastly larger scale. He established a clear hierarchy of administration, with the Council of Terra at its apex. But he also created regional divisions that could make decisions without constantly referring back to Terra. He understood that centralization had limits in an empire this large. Light itself took years to travel from one end of the Imperium to the other.
I have to pause here and just say something about Malcador that really strikes me. In a universe full of superhuman warriors who can spit acid and break tanks with their bare hands, this elderly administrator is somehow one of my favorite characters in all of Warhammer lore. There's something deeply human about him, right? He's not superhuman, he's not gene-forged, he's just this incredibly old man who chose to dedicate his entire existence to a cause he believed in. And unlike the Primarchs who sometimes acted like petulant children despite being demigods, Malcador just did his job day after day for centuries. No glory, no monuments, just endless paperwork and impossible decisions. That's real heroism to me, the kind that doesn't get songs written about it. Anyway, back to the story.
Waiting for approval from Terra for every decision would make governance impossible. So he created systems that allowed local administrators to operate with significant autonomy while still adhering to core imperial principles. He created standardized procedures for bringing new worlds into compliance, essentially writing the rulebook for how to integrate an alien or human world into the Imperium. These procedures covered everything from initial contact protocols to military occupation procedures to long-term governance structures. They were flexible enough to adapt to different situations, but rigid enough to ensure consistency across the Imperium. A world brought into compliance in Segmentum Ultima would be governed by the same basic principles as a world in Segmentum Pacificus. The communication networks he established were marvels of psychic engineering. He set up chains of astropaths, psychically gifted individuals who could send messages through the warp across vast distances. These psychic relay stations allowed orders from Terra to reach the furthest corners of the Imperium in weeks or months instead of years or decades. It was still slow by any modern standard, but it was revolutionary compared to the complete isolation that had characterized the Age of Strife. For the first time in millennia, humanity was connected again and able to coordinate across interstellar distances. He personally oversaw the training of thousands of administrators and bureaucrats who would be sent out to manage newly conquered worlds. These weren't just paper pushers, they were the people who would turn conquered territories into functioning parts of the Imperium. They needed to understand imperial law, logistics, economics, military organization, cultural management, and dozens of other fields. Malcador established training academies on Terra and other major worlds, creating a professional class of imperial administrators who could be deployed wherever they were needed. He also had to manage the delicate balance between the military and civilian branches of imperial governance. The Space Marine legions and Imperial Army were focused on conquest, as Malcador's administrators were focused on consolidation. These different priorities often led to conflict. A legion commander might want to immediately move on to the next target, while an administrator might need more time to establish proper governance structures on the newly conquered world. Malcador had to navigate these conflicts, deciding when military concerns should take priority and when civilian administration needed more time and resources. The imperial tithe system, which would become the primary means of funding imperial operations for the next 10,000 years, was largely Malcador's creation. He established the formulas for calculating how much each world should contribute based on its population, resources, and economic capacity. He created the mechanisms for collecting this tithe and distributing it where it was needed. He set up oversight systems to prevent corruption and ensure that tithes were fairly assessed. It was an enormous undertaking that required careful thought about economics, logistics, and human nature. Malcador also had to deal with the Mechanicum of Mars, a completely separate power structure within the Imperium, with its own hierarchy, traditions, and jealously guarded technological knowledge. The Treaty of Mars had made them allies, but the relationship was often tense. The Mechanicum resented any attempt to interfere with their internal affairs, while Malcador needed to coordinate their production and ensure their loyalty. He spent countless hours in negotiations with fabricator generals and magos, carefully maintaining the alliance while advancing imperial interests. It was tedious work, unglamorous and often thankless. While the emperor and his primarchs won glorious victories and were celebrated throughout the Imperium, Malcador sat in offices deep within the imperial palace, reviewing reports, making decisions about resource allocation, settling disputes between administrators, and solving problems that most people never even knew existed. He worked long hours every day, surrounded by data slates and reports, communicating with administrators across the galaxy, making 1,000 small decisions that collectively kept civilization functioning. But he never complained. This was his role, and he understood its vital importance better than anyone. The Emperor could conquer a world in a day, could inspire loyalty with a single speech, could shatter armies with his psychic might. But making sure that conquered world remained loyal and productive for the next 1,000 years required the kind of patient, detailed work that Malcador excelled at. Conquest was dramatic and visible. Administration was subtle and often invisible. But without it, the Imperium would have collapsed under its own weight within a generation. He approached his work with the same dedication he had once brought to his duties as a sigillite. Just as he had once worked to preserve humanity's heritage, he now labored to build humanity's future. Every system he created, every procedure he established, every administrator he trained was part of building something that would outlast him, that would continue functioning long after he was gone. He was laying foundations that would support the weight of the largest empire humanity had ever known. His relationship with the Primarchs as they were found and reunited with the Emperor was complex and varied. To most of them, he was a respected elder, a figure of authority second only to the Emperor himself. Some developed genuine affection for him, treating him almost like a grandfather. Others were more distant, though they respected his position and his obvious importance to the Emperor. Malcador approached each Primarch differently, understanding that beings created to be generals and conquerors, each had unique personalities and needs that required individualized approaches. The second Primarch to be found was Leman Russ of the Space Wolves. Russ came from Fenris, a brutal world of ice and violence, and the culture shock of being thrust into the sophisticated Imperium was immense. But the Emperor assigned Malcador to help the Wolf King adapt to his new role. It was an inspired choice. Where the Emperor might have been too distant and the other Primarchs too competitive, Malcador offered patient mentorship without any of the ego that might have complicated the relationship. Malcador spent considerable time with Russ in those early days, not just teaching him about the Imperium, but learning from him as well. The Wolf King had a straightforward honor that Malcador found refreshing after dealing with the complex politics of Terra. Russ was brutal but honest, savage but loyal. He didn't dissemble or play political games. If he disagreed with you, he said so directly. If he gave his word, he kept it. These were qualities that Malcador valued deeply. During their time together, Malcador taught Russ about the broader Imperial project, helping him understand that the Great Crusade wasn't just about conquest, but about building something that would last. He introduced the Wolf King to the complexities of governance, the importance of administration, the need for systems that could function across impossible distances. Russ might not have enjoyed these lessons, but he absorbed them, understanding that his role as a Primarch required more than just leading his warriors into battle. In return, Russ taught Malcador about the value of direct action, of sometimes cutting through political complexity with decisive force. The Wolf King's perspective helped balance Malcador's tendency toward careful deliberation with the understanding that some problems required immediate, violent solutions. Thus, they developed a mutual respect that would deepen into genuine friendship over the years. Malcador and Russ grew close during this period. They shared a certain pragmatism, a willingness to do what was necessary even when it was unpleasant. The Sigillite taught the Wolf King about the realities of imperial politics and the responsibilities that came with leading a legion. In return, Russ offered loyalty and, perhaps more importantly, friendship. Their bond would prove important in the years to come, particularly during the Council of Nicaea and the dark days of the Horus Heresy. Russ would later describe Malcador as perhaps the most powerful psyker in the galaxy after the Emperor, a remarkable assessment given the Wolf King's general distrust of psychic powers. With other Primarchs, Malcador's relationships took different forms. In Jagatai Khan of the White Scars, with his philosophical nature and love of freedom, engaged Malcador in long discussions about the nature of humanity and the purpose of the Imperium. The Khan challenged many of Malcador's assumptions, forcing him to articulate and sometimes reconsider positions he had held for centuries. These conversations were intellectually stimulating for Malcador, who found that debating with a Primarch required him to think more carefully about the foundations of imperial policy. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels held a special place in Malcador's regard. The angel was perhaps the most genuinely noble of all the Primarchs, carrying himself with a grace and compassion that reminded Malcador of the best aspects of humanity. Despite his martial prowess, Sanguinius had a gentle soul that resonated with Malcador's own desire to build rather than destroy. They shared a similar vision of what the Imperium could become, a place where beauty and culture flourished alongside military might. Guilliman of the Ultramarines was another Primarch with whom Malcador found common ground. The Lord of Ultramar shared Malcador's appreciation for administration and good governance. While other Primarchs focused primarily on military conquest, Guilliman understood the importance of what came after the battles were won. He built functioning societies on the worlds he conquered, establishing systems that would keep them productive and loyal for generations. Malcador recognized in Guilliman a kindred spirit, someone who understood that empire building required more than just victory in battle. Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists was a Primarch Malcador would come to rely on heavily, particularly during the crisis of the Horus Heresy. Dawn's steadfast loyalty and defensive genius made him the perfect choice to fortify Terra against the coming storm. Malcador and Dawn worked closely together during the siege, coordinating defenses and making the hard decisions required to keep the throne world from falling. Their relationship was more formal than Malcador's friendship with Russ, but built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. Not all of Malcador's interactions with the Primarchs were positive, however. His relationship with Lorgar of the Wordbearers was particularly troubled. Lorgar's insistence on worshipping the Emperor as a god directly contradicted everything the imperial truth stood for. But when the Emperor ordered the destruction of Monarchia to punish Lorgar for spreading religion, Malcador was there to deliver the message and oversee the humiliation. The incident where Lorgar struck him revealed the depth of the Primarch's resentment, and Malcador came to see Lorgar as a potential threat long before the Wordbearer's fall to chaos became obvious. Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns was another complex relationship. Malcador recognized Magnus's genius and his genuine desire to advance human understanding of psychic phenomena, but he also saw the dangers in Magnus's approach, the way the Crimson King pushed boundaries without fully considering the consequences. Malcador tried to counsel moderation, to help Magnus understand why the Emperor was so cautious about delving too deeply into warp-related knowledge. But Magnus, as supremely confident in his own abilities, rarely listened to warnings about the dangers he courted. With Horus Lupercal, before his fall, Malcador maintained a cordial but somewhat distant relationship. Horus was the Emperor's favorite, the chosen war master, and he knew it. He had a certain arrogance that Malcador found off-putting, though he recognized Horus's undeniable brilliance as a military commander and leader of men. When Horus was given command of the entire Great Crusade and the Emperor returned to Terra, Malcador watched carefully, understanding that this concentration of power in one individual represented both an opportunity and a risk. These varied relationships with the Primarchs revealed Malcador's skill at reading people and adapting his approach to each individual. He understood that these were not just superhuman warriors, but complex beings with their own motivations, fears, and dreams. Some needed guidance, others needed space. Some responded to intellectual argument, others to emotional appeal. Malcador tailored his interactions with each Primarch to what they needed, what they would respond to, always working toward the larger goal of building an Imperium that would endure. Not all of Malcador's interactions with the Primarchs were so positive. During the campaign on the world of Monarchia, where the Emperor publicly humiliated Lorgar and the word-bearers for spreading religion instead of the imperial truth, Lorgar struck Malcador in a moment of rage. The blow sent the Sigillite flying 20 meters through the air, and a hit that should have killed any normal human and would have seriously injured even a space marine. But Malcador survived, getting back to his feet with only minor injuries. This incident revealed something important. Malcador was far more than he appeared to be. That frail old man's body housed something much more durable. Whether this was due to his nature as a perpetual, some psychic protection, or technology, we don't fully understand. The message was clear. Malcador was not to be underestimated. The incident also set Lorgar on a dark path. The humiliation he suffered, combined with his resentment of both the Emperor and Malcador, made him susceptible to the whispers of chaos. It was one of many moments where, in hindsight, we can see the seeds of the Horus heresy being planted. As the Great Crusade progressed, a controversy developed that would have profound implications for the future. What to do about psychic powers within the Space Marine legions? Some legions, particularly the Thousand Sons under Magnus the Red, had developed extensive libraries of psychic knowledge and trained their battle brothers in the use of warp-derived powers. Other legions, particularly the Space Wolves under Leman Russ and the Death Guard under Mortarion, viewed these practices with deep suspicion, seeing them as dangerous sorcery that risked demonic corruption. The disagreement became so severe that it threatened the unity of the Crusade itself. Legions that should have been working together were instead at each other's throats, hurling accusations of heresy and ignorance. The Emperor recognized that this could not continue and called for a great council to settle the matter once and for all. The Council of Nicaea was convened in the year 001.M31, on a world that had only recently been discovered and terraformed by the Mechanicum specifically to host this gathering. It was to be a debate, a forum where both sides could present their arguments and the Emperor could make a final ruling that all legions would be bound to follow. Malcador the Sigillite was chosen to preside over the council, carrying the Emperor's golden scepter as a symbol that he spoke with full imperial authority. It was a natural choice. The Emperor himself would be present, but he would sit in judgment above the proceedings, letting his regent facilitate the actual debate. As Malcador's skill at navigating complex political situations made him ideal for managing what was certain to be a contentious gathering. The amphitheater on Nicaea was massive, capable of seating tens of thousands. Primarchs sat in positions of honor. Space Marines from all the legions attended to witness the proceedings. Imperial army officers and senior administrators filled other sections. The air was thick with tension as everyone waited to see how this fundamental question about the nature of psychic power would be resolved. Malcador opened the council by announcing that everyone gathered had been summoned to freely debate the issue, causing some surprise among those who had expected a more controlled proceeding. He framed the question clearly. Was the use of librarians and psychic powers within the legions merely a tool like any other, or was it dangerous sorcery that threatened to corrupt the Imperium from within? He invited anyone to make the first speech. The debate that followed was passionate and often bitter. The first to speak was Othore Wordmake, a rune priest of the Space Wolves, who condemned the Thousand Sons as warlocks and sorcerers despite being a psyker himself. This hypocrisy was not lost on the audience, but it set the tone for much of what followed. Mortarion of the Death Guard spoke powerfully against the use of psychic powers, drawing on his own experiences on the Death World where he'd been raised. He had seen what sorcery could do, how it could corrupt and destroy. And he reminded everyone that the Age of Strife had been caused in large part by psykers tampering with forces they didn't understand. He pointed to the Sisters of Silence, an entire organization dedicated to hunting and controlling dangerous psykers, as proof that psychic powers were a threat that needed to be contained. On the other side, librarians from various legions argued that psychic powers were simply another tool, no more inherently dangerous than a bolter or a chainsword. They contended that proper training and discipline could make psykers into powerful assets for the Imperium. They pointed out that the Emperor himself was a psyker of unmatched power, as were the navigators who guided ships through the warp. Banning psychic powers entirely would cripple the Imperium. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, was notably silent through much of the debate. He arrived late, having been kept ignorant of the true nature of the council until the last moment. When he finally did speak, it was with passion and eloquence, defending the pursuit of knowledge and the controlled use of psychic powers. But by then, the mood of the council had already turned against him. Malcador presided over it all with patience and skill. He gave everyone a chance to speak. He asked clarifying questions when necessary. He kept the debate from devolving into outright violence, which, given the tempers involved, was no small feat. And through it all, he was evaluating, considering, trying to find the path that would best serve the Imperium. In the end, it was the Emperor who made the final ruling, and he decreed that the use of psychic powers beyond those of navigators and astropaths would be banned. The librarious departments in all legions were to be disbanded. Space Marines with psychic abilities were to return to normal duties and refrain from using their powers. The pursuit of knowledge related to sorcery and the warp was forbidden. It was a harsh ruling, harsher than many had expected. Magnus in particular was devastated, though he bowed to his father's will. The Thousand Suns would have to completely restructure their legion. Other legions that had developed librarious programs would have to abandon years of work and training. But the council had another outcome, one that Malcador announced in what became known as the Chaplain Edict. Every Space Marine Legion would establish a new position called Chaplain, based on the practice of the Wordbearer's Legion. These chaplains would be responsible for maintaining the spiritual health of their brothers, ensuring adherence to the imperial truth, and watching for any deviation from the Emperor's commands, including the secret use of psychic powers. This was Malcador's contribution, a way to ensure compliance with the Emperor's decree, while also addressing some of the concerns that had led to the council in the first place. The chaplains would become one of the most important positions within the Space Marine legions, their distinctive skull helms a symbol of authority and spiritual guidance. What no one at the council could have known was that this ruling would have catastrophic consequences. Magnus, utterly forbidden from using his psychic abilities to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery when he discovered it, would instead smash through the Emperor's psychic wards around the Imperial Palace in a desperate attempt to deliver his warning. This would shatter the Emperor's Webway project and leave him bound to the Golden Throne, ultimately making the entire Horus heresy possible. The irony is almost painful. The Council of Nicaea was meant to prevent the corruption of the legions by psychic powers. Instead, it helped enable the greatest betrayal in human history. But in the moment, as the council concluded and the Primarchs and their legions departed Nicaea, Malcador believed they had done the right thing. He had seen the dangers of uncontrolled psychic power. He knew the threats that lurked in the warp. If restricting the use of psychic abilities made the Imperium safer, then it was a price worth paying. History would prove him tragically wrong. The Horus heresy began with a betrayal so profound, so unexpected, that it shook the foundations of the Imperium. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the Emperor's most favored son, the one who had been entrusted with command of the entire Great Crusade, turned traitor. He was corrupted by the ruinous powers, those dark gods of chaos that the Emperor had spent centuries trying to shield humanity from. And in his corruption, Horus brought fully half the Space Marine legions with him. The news reached Terra slowly, carried by refugees and survivors from the Istvan system, where Horus had revealed his treachery by ordering the deaths of loyalist elements within his own forces. When the full scope of the betrayal became clear, when it was understood that not just Horus, but also Fulgrim, Perturabo, Angron, Mortarion, Magnus, Lorgar, Alfarius, and their entire legions had turned against the Emperor, the shock was almost incomprehensible. For Malcador, this was a crisis, unlike anything he had faced in his thousands of years of life. The Imperium that he and the Emperor had spent centuries building was tearing itself apart. Brother would fight brother. Worlds that had been brought into compliance would burn. And worst of all, the Emperor himself was now trapped on Terra, unable to lead his forces as he had during the Great Crusade, because he had to maintain the psychic wards around the damaged Webway project beneath the Imperial Palace. The old man felt the weight of every one of his 6,700 years. He had seen the worst that the Age of Strife could offer, but this was different. This was a civil war that would determine the fate of the entire species. And with the Emperor forced to remain on the Golden Throne maintaining the barriers against the demonic, it would fall to Malcador to coordinate much of the loyalist response. He was afflicted by despair. His life had been devoted to the Emperor's cause since their fateful meeting centuries ago, but he had never been a warrior or a general. His skills lay in administration and diplomacy, not military strategy. The idea that Space Marine legions, the finest warriors humanity had ever created, could betray their oaths of loyalty was inconceivable to him. How could Primarchs, beings designed to be the pinnacle of human achievement, turn to chaos? The question threatened to drive him mad, but the Emperor assured him that as long as he drew breath, the evil that assailed them would not conquer humanity. And Malcador, drawing on reserves of strength he barely knew he possessed, steeled himself for the trials ahead. If the Imperium was to survive this crucible, someone had to do the unglamorous work of organization and preparation. Someone had to think beyond the immediate crisis and plan for the future, even if that future seemed impossibly dark. One of his first actions was to begin laying the groundwork for new imperial institutions that would be needed in the aftermath of the heresy, assuming there was an aftermath. Very soon after the outbreak of the war, the Emperor told Malcador to summon individuals of character, skill, and determination who would be tested and trained to become an elite group of investigators tasked with rooting out treachery and heresy. This marked the founding of what would eventually become the Inquisition. Among the first people Malcador approached for this duty were Nathaniel Garrow, a former Death Guard captain who had escaped the massacre at Istvan and brought word of Horus's betrayal to Terra, and Iacton Cruz, a veteran sons of Horus captain who had remained loyal when his legion turned traitor. These were men who had proven their loyalty beyond any doubt, who had stood against their own brothers when those brothers fell to chaos. Malcador tasked Garrow with recruiting additional individuals for this new organization. They would be called the Knights Errant, and their purpose would be manifold. Some would investigate potential traitors within the Imperium. Others would serve as special operatives for missions too sensitive or dangerous for regular forces. All of them would wear Malcador's personal sigil, a stylized eye that would eventually become the symbol of the Inquisition itself. Under Malcador's seal, Garrow traveled across the war-torn Imperium, seeking out loyalists from both the traitor and loyalist legions. He found Tylos Rubio, an Ultramarines librarian who had been recruited during the Battle of Calth. He found Mesa Varan, Iacton Cruz, and others. Even Garviel Loken, former captain of the Lunar Wolves, and a man everyone thought had died at Istvan, was recovered and brought into the fold, though the ordeal had driven him temporarily insane. These Knights Errant would become the foundation of something greater. Malcador was looking beyond the immediate war, planning for the threats that would remain even after Horus was defeated. Chaos had shown its hand. The demonic was real. The warp was not just a dimension used for travel, but a realm of hostile intelligences that sought to corrupt and destroy humanity. The Imperium would need dedicated warriors to fight this threat, warriors who understood the enemy and could stand against it without falling to corruption themselves. This led to another of Malcador's great projects during the heresy, the founding of the Grey Knights. The Emperor had realized that he had made a mistake when he created the original Space Marine legions. They had been designed to fight physical threats, alien species, and human rebels. But they were not prepared for the psychic and spiritual warfare that the forces of chaos represented. A new type of Space Marine was needed, one specifically trained and equipped to combat demons and sorcery. Malcador took on the task of creating this new chapter with his typical thoroughness. He selected 8 Space Marines from among the most exceptional of his knights errant. These would become the first Grand Masters of the Grey Knights, the leaders who would build the chapter into the premier demon-hunting force in the galaxy. Their identities were kept secret even from Imperial records, known only by their new names: Janus, Epimetheus, Chiron, Koios, Ogun, Iapto, Jotun, and Satre. Originally, Garviel Loken had been selected to be the 9th Grand Master, but he refused the honor. He had a feeling that his fate lay elsewhere, that joining the Grey Knights was not his destiny. He would later be proven tragically correct when he was murdered by the Chaos Space Marine Erebus, shortly after the Emperor's final confrontation with Horus. Malcador also recruited 4 human lords and administrators who would form the foundation of the Inquisition itself. These included Kirill Sinderman, a former iterator who had survived the massacre at Istvan, and other individuals whose identities remain uncertain in the historical record. Together with the 8 Space Marines, these 12 individuals represented the future defense of humanity against chaos. But getting them to where they needed to be required one of Malcador's most impressive feats of psychic power. Using methods provided by an unusual source, an Eldar human hybrid named Ael Wintor, who served as Malcador's confessor, and whom the Sigillite repeatedly cloned after driving each version to suicide by sharing too many secrets. Malcador hid the entire moon of Titan in the warp. This was not a small accomplishment. Titan was massive, and keeping it concealed from both physical and psychic detection, while also protecting its inhabitants from the dangers of the warp, required incredible power and concentration. When the chosen individuals arrived at Titan, they found a fortress monastery already fully prepared and stocked with everything necessary to create a new chapter of Space Marines. Supplies of gene seed, suspected to have been taken from the Emperor himself, awaited them. Weapons and armor had been stockpiled. Most remarkably, hundreds of suitable recruits from across the galaxy were already present, some raw and untrained, others secretly selected from loyalist legions. Malcador appointed Janus, one of the 8 founding Space Marines, to be the Grey Knights' first Supreme Grand Master. Then he left them, returning to Terra to continue his work. When Titan would finally re-emerge from the warp after the heresy ended, time would have passed differently there due to the vagaries of warp travel. The 8 Space Marines and their recruits had become a full chapter of 1,000 battle brothers, fully trained and ready to wage war against the demonic. While establishing these future-focused institutions, Malcador was also dealing with the immediate crisis of the war. He worked closely with Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, who had been tasked with fortifying Terra against the inevitable attack. Together, they assessed the defenses of the throne world, identified weaknesses, and coordinated the construction of massive fortifications. Malcador also used his secret position as Grand Master of Assassins to attempt to strike directly at the traitors. Multiple assassination attempts were made against Horus himself, including the first ever execution force, a team of multiple assassins from different temples working together. Some came tantalizingly close to their target, but none succeeded. Eventually, on the Emperor's own orders, the attempts were called off. The Emperor still hoped that his favored son could be saved from Chaos's corruption. Another assassination attempt focused on a different approach. Malcador worked with Leman Russ and the Knights Errant to strike at Horus, while the War Master was engaged in battle on the world of Molech. Malcador selected Garviel Loken, who had only recently recovered from his madness, to command the mission. It was a dangerous gambit, infiltrating behind enemy lines to strike at the heart of the traitor forces. The mission ultimately failed, though it came closer to success than many expected. Loken and his team managed to board Horus's flagship and even confronted the War Master directly, but Horus was too powerful, too deeply corrupted by chaos, and the knights errant were forced to flee. Several of them died in the attempt, including Iacton Cruz, the half-herd, who had been one of the first to join Malcador's cause. As the war progressed and the traitor forces began their advance toward Terra, and Malcador found himself increasingly strained, he appeared at war councils alongside Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, Jagatai Khan, Constantin Valdor, and other loyalist commanders, offering what strategic insight he could. But he was growing ever more weary, the weight of the war pressing down on him. He clashed with some of the loyalists over the harsh measures he deemed necessary. When Garviel Loken confronted him about an order to execute prisoners to prevent them from falling into traitor hands, Malcador defended the decision as necessary to preserve humanity. It was a dark moment, showing how the war was forcing even the most principled individuals to make terrible choices. Yet there were also moments of compassion. When Loken asked for permission to leave Terra to rescue Mercedes Ollerton, at a remembrancer who had survived the massacre at Ishtvan, Malcador granted it. He mused that an act of compassion might be what was needed in this time of darkness, a reminder that they were fighting to preserve humanity, not just as a species, but as a moral concept. Malcador also met with the Emperor in strange psychic encounters within the warp itself. In one such meeting, he appeared as a man in gold, while the Emperor took the form of a weary old man in furs, huddling over a fire. These meetings were symbolic, showing the toll the war was taking on both of them. Malcador informed the Emperor of Horus's movements and strategies, while the Emperor shared what he could perceive from his position on the Golden Throne. One of the most dangerous moments came when Magnus the Red, now fully committed to chaos, infiltrated the Imperial Palace with a group of Thousand Sons warriors. They confronted Malcador deep beneath the palace at a subterranean lake. Magnus attempted to turn Malcador to the traitor cause, or at least to recover a shard of his own soul that had been left on Terra. When Malcador revealed that the soul shard was now beyond Magnus's reach, having been implanted into the being that would become Janus, one of the founding Grey Knights, the Crimson King became enraged and seemingly killed Malcador with a psychic blast. It was a devastating moment, one that nearly cost the Imperium one of its most important figures. But Malcador was saved by Olivia Soreka, a perpetual who had been aiding him. Soreka transferred her own life essence to restore Malcador, sacrificing herself so that the Sigillite could continue his work. Thence it was another example of the terrible sacrifices being made across the Imperium as the war reached its crescendo. As the siege of Terra began and traitor forces descended on the throne world, Malcador stayed in the heart of the Imperial Palace, coordinating defenses and preparing for what he knew was coming. He appeared in council meetings looking increasingly ragged and worn, the stress of the war evident in every line of his ancient face. But he never stopped working, never gave in to despair. He investigated attacks by cultists and demonic incursions within Terra itself. He coordinated the defense of key locations. He made hard decisions about resource allocation and population management. All the unglamorous, brutal work of defending a world under siege fell to him while the Primarchs and their forces fought the visible war. And through it all, he knew what was coming. He knew that eventually, the Emperor would have to leave the Golden Throne to confront Horus directly. And he knew that when that happened, someone would have to take the Emperor's place on that terrible machine, holding back the demonic tide that constantly pressed against the wards around the broken webway. Originally, that someone was supposed to be Magnus the Red. The Emperor had planned for his psychically powerful son to eventually take over the burden of the Golden Throne, freeing him to pursue other projects. But Magnus had turned traitor, and there was no one else with sufficient power to maintain the wards for more than a few hours. No one except Malcador. The Siege of Terror reached its climax as traitor forces smashed through the outer defenses and began assaulting the walls of the Imperial Palace itself. Billions died in the fighting. Entire districts of the planet were reduced to smoking rubble. The sky itself seemed to burn as orbital bombardments rained down and psychic energies tore reality apart. In the throne room, deep beneath the palace, the Emperor sat upon the golden throne, using every ounce of his psychic might to hold back the demons that sought to pour through the shattered webway gate. He had been sitting there for years, unable to leave even for a moment, directing the defense of Terra through psychic messages and orders relayed by Malcador and others. But Horus had made a critical mistake. In his arrogance, believing that the Emperor was trapped and helpless, the War Master lowered the shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. It was a taunt, a challenge, an invitation for the Emperor to come and face him if he dared. Horus believed the Emperor couldn't leave the Golden Throne without Terra being overrun by demons. He was right, of course. The Emperor couldn't leave. But Malcador could take his place. The Sigillite had known this moment was coming. He had prepared himself for it as best he could, though there was no real way to prepare for what he was about to do. The Golden Throne required psychic power on a scale that only the Emperor possessed. Malcador was perhaps the second most powerful psyker in the galaxy, but he was still a mortal, his abilities nothing compared to the Emperor's might. Taking the throne would kill him. He knew this. The Emperor knew this. Everyone who understood what was being asked knew this. But there was no alternative. If Horus was to be stopped, the Emperor had to confront him. And if the Emperor was to leave the Golden Throne, someone had to take his place, even if only for a few hours. Malcador agreed without hesitation. After thousands of years of friendship, after centuries of building the Imperium together, after all they had accomplished and all they had endured, this was his final service to his oldest friend. He would sit on the Golden Throne. He would hold back the demons. He would buy the Emperor the time needed to end Horus and save humanity. Before ascending the throne, Malcador had one last duty to perform. And he brought 12 individuals before the Emperor to present his final work. The 8 founders of the Grey Knights and the 4 founders of the Inquisition. The Emperor examined them, peering into their hearts and souls, and pronounced himself satisfied. These would be the defenders of humanity against chaos in the dark millennia to come. Then Malcador sent out psychic messages to all his other agents and chosen servants across the galaxy, giving them their final instructions. His work was to continue even after his death. The organizations he had built would endure. With all preparations complete, Malcador approached the Golden Throne. Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, Vulcan, and Constantin Valdor tried to help him, knowing that he would never walk down from that terrible seat again. When the Emperor stood up from the throne, Malcador was momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer psychic might that radiated from him. He nearly cracked his head on the steps before catching himself. Then the Emperor spoke words that would echo through the ages. "Behold the greatest sacrifice of our age. Malcador the Sigillite is no more. Henceforth, he shall always and only ever be Malcador the hero." And with that pronouncement, Malcador sat upon the Golden Throne. The pain was immediate and unimaginable. The Golden Throne was designed to channel and amplify psychic power, to take the Emperor's might and focus it into maintaining the wards around the Webway Gate. For Malcador, whose power was vast by any normal standard, but minuscule compared to the Emperor's, it was like trying to channel the light of a star through a candle. His body began to burn away almost immediately. Our skin blackened and peeled. Muscles tore and reformed under the psychic strain. Bones creaked and cracked. Every nerve screamed in agony. But he held on, pouring everything he had into maintaining the barriers, keeping the demons at bay. The psychic torment was even worse than the physical. Malcador gained a new awareness, seeing the universe the way the Emperor saw it for the first time. He perceived the warp in all its terrible glory, saw the demonic entities pressing against the wards, felt the malevolent intelligence of the Chaos Gods themselves. It was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure, a vista of possibility and corruption that threatened to overwhelm his mind. And then, Horus invaded his consciousness, using his own sorcerous powers to show Malcador the plight of the Imperial forces aboard the vengeful spirit. Yet the War Master wanted him to see the Emperor and his companions struggling, wanted him to feel doubt and despair, wanted him to give up. But Malcador persevered. He was 6,700 years old. He had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. He had survived the worst of the age of strife. He had helped build the greatest empire humanity had ever known. A mere primarch, even one as powerful and corrupt as Horus, would not break him. He even managed to send subtle psychic clues to Imperial heroes fighting aboard the vengeful spirit, aiding them in their journey to Lupercal's court, where Horus waited. It was a testament to his incredible will that he could do anything beyond simply holding the wards. But Malcador had never been one to do the bare minimum. Hours passed. Each moment was an eternity of suffering. As Malcador's body continued to dissolve, his flesh literally burning away as the power of the Golden Throne consumed him. But he held on. The Emperor needed time. Humanity needed time. So Malcador would give them time, paying for it with his life, atom by atom, moment by moment. By the time traitor forces began pounding on the doors to the throne room itself, trying to break through and kill whoever sat upon the throne, Malcador's body had largely dissolved. He was little more than a skeletal figure wrapped in ash, holding on through sheer force of will. Vulcan, stationed as a guardian, began to activate the talisman of 7 hammers, a failsafe that would destroy not just the palace, but all of Terra if the throne room fell. Malcador despaired, wanting to tell Vulcan to stop, but no longer able to speak. If the talisman was activated, everything would be lost. But he couldn't communicate, couldn't do anything but maintain the wards and endure. Then, finally, it ended. Rogal Dorn and Constantin Valdor returned, carrying the Emperor's broken body. Horus was dead, slain by his father in a final confrontation that had left the Emperor mortally wounded. The war was won, but at a terrible cost. The Emperor's body was brought to the Golden Throne. When he was placed back upon it, he used the last of his strength to transfer just enough power back to Malcador to allow the ancient sigillite to speak one final time. They said their goodbyes, these two immortals who had walked together for centuries. Malcador expressed hope that fragments of himself would live on in the Golden Throne and in his chosen successors. Yet he acknowledged that the foundations of the Imperium were no longer himself and the Emperor, but the institutions they had built and the people they had trained. And then, Malcador the hero allowed himself to die. His body, already reduced to ash, crumbled completely. His soul, which had held on through sheer force of will long after his physical form should have failed, finally fizzled out. He bid farewell to his oldest friend and released his grip on life. Sanguinius, Dawn, and Vulcan, who witnessed this final moment, were devastated. They could feel the sigillite's focus and his pain. They could sense his sadness, which Sanguinius gently corrected was actually the Emperor's sadness, the grief of losing the one person who had been with him from the beginning, who had believed in his vision before anyone else, who had remained loyal when even his own sons betrayed him. The Emperor made no reply. Was he overwhelmed with love for his old friend, with speechless admiration at the scale of Malcador's sacrifice? Or was he simply too wounded, too close to death himself, to express what he felt? We'll never know. The Emperor was then sealed within the Golden Throne, beginning his 10,000-year vigil, and he has never spoken since. Malcador's ashen remains were gathered with reverence and sealed into a tomb deep beneath the citadel of Titan, the fortress monastery of the Grey Knights. The tomb is now guarded by Terminators of the Grey Knights' First Brotherhood, treating these ashes as sacred relics. Some believe the remains have properties that can ward off demonic influence, that even in death, Malcador continues to protect humanity. Yet the Imperium that Malcador helped build would endure for 10,000 years and counting, but it would be a very different Imperium from what he and the Emperor had envisioned. The imperial truth gave way to the worship of the Emperor as a god, the very thing Malcador had warned against. The Imperium became hidebound and stagnant, more concerned with maintaining the status quo than advancing human knowledge. Innovation was viewed with suspicion. New ideas were treated as potential heresy. The vibrant, expanding empire of the Great Crusade became a fortress under siege, holding back the darkness, but making little progress toward the bright future it had once promised. But Malcador's legacy lived on in the institutions he had created. The administratum, though bloated and inefficient by later standards, it continued to hold the Imperium together across millions of worlds. The Inquisition rooted out heresy and protected humanity from the corrupting influence of chaos. The Grey Knights stood as humanity's shield against the demonic, never wavering in their duty. The chaplains maintained the spiritual health of the Space Marine chapters, ensuring that the mistakes of the heresy would not be repeated. Even the rank of Imperial Regent, the position Malcador had held, would be revived in the 41st Millennium, when Reboot Guilliman returned from his long stasis. Guilliman would take on the burden of running the Imperium, much as Malcador had done, finding himself drowning in the same administrative minutiae that his predecessor had navigated with such skill. Malcador's name lived on in other ways as well. A class of heavy tank bore his name, the Malcador series, which, though inferior to the Lemon Russ battle tank in many ways, still saw service in regiments like the Death Corps of Krieg. It was a humble memorial for such a towering figure, but perhaps fitting. Malcador had never sought glory or monuments. He had simply done his duty day after day, year after year, century after century, until that duty demanded his life. Stories of Malcador the hero were told throughout the Imperium, though like all stories passed down through millennia, they became distorted and mythologized. Some tales portrayed him as a great warrior wizard who fought alongside the Emperor in countless battles. Others depicted him as a saint whose prayers could work miracles. A few even suggested he had been a secret Primarch, the lost 21st son, who had been too humble to claim his place among his brothers. The truth, as is often the case, was more complex and more interesting than the legends. Malcador was not a warrior, though he could fight when necessary. He was not a saint, though he was perhaps the most selfless individual in Imperial history. He was not a Primarch, though his contribution to the Imperium was arguably greater than any of them. He was an old man who understood people and systems, who could navigate complex political situations with ease, who believed deeply in a vision of humanity's future, and dedicated his life to making that vision real. He was the hand that turned grand ideas into practical policy, the voice that spoke when the Emperor could not, the mind that solved problems too mundane for a god, but too important to ignore. He was proof that you didn't need to be a superhuman warrior to change the galaxy. Sometimes what humanity needed most was a patient administrator, a skilled diplomat, a friend who would tell you the truth even when it was uncomfortable to hear. The specific nature of Malcador's powers remains somewhat mysterious, as he tended to work subtly and avoid the flashy displays that characterized other powerful psykers. But from various accounts and observations, we can piece together a picture of his capabilities. First and foremost, Malcador was a telepath of extraordinary skill. He could communicate across interstellar distances, sending messages to individuals on the far side of the galaxy with perfect clarity. This wasn't just simple mind-to-mind contact. He could convey complex ideas, share memories, and coordinate multiple individuals simultaneously. During the heresy, he maintained psychic links with all his various agents, giving them instructions and receiving reports in real time despite the vast distances involved. His telepathic abilities also extended to combat applications. When facing Magnus the Red's invasion of the Imperial Palace, Malcador engaged in psychic warfare with the Crimson King, one of the most powerful psykers in existence. He lost that particular confrontation, seeming to die from Magnus's assault, but the fact that he could engage at all speaks to his capabilities. Lesser psykers would have been annihilated instantly by Magnus's power. Malcador's longevity was itself a form of power. As a perpetual, he simply did not age in the normal way. 6,700 years of accumulated knowledge and experience gave him advantages that no amount of raw psychic strength could match. He had seen patterns play out over centuries and could predict how events would unfold with uncanny accuracy. His memory was perfect, able to recall his own birth with complete clarity, meaning nothing he learned was ever truly forgotten. His physical resilience was remarkable. When Lorgar struck him with a blow that should have killed him instantly, Malcador got back up with only minor injuries. Some of this was likely psychic shielding, a constant low-level protective field that he maintained unconsciously, but it also suggested that his body, like his mind, was more durable than it appeared. That frail old man's form concealed reserves of strength that normal humans couldn't access. Malcador demonstrated talents in a wide range of psychic disciplines. He could cloud minds, making himself and others invisible to observation. He could hide entire locations from psychic detection, as he did with Titan when he concealed the moon in the warp. He could influence emotions and thoughts, though he seemed reluctant to use this ability except when absolutely necessary. He could sense the intentions and loyalties of those around him, making him nearly impossible to deceive. His ability to use the Eldar-human hybrid, El Wintor, as a psychic conduit suggests he understood racial psychic abilities beyond standard human talents. Wintor served as both confessor and tool, repeatedly cloned and used until driven to suicide by the weight of Malcador's secrets, only to be cloned again. It was a dark aspect of Malcador's character, showing that even he was capable of ruthless pragmatism when he believed it necessary. When Malcador sat upon the Golden Throne, he gained what he described as a new awareness, seeing the universe as the Emperor saw it. For a brief time, despite the agonizing pain, he experienced existence from a perspective few beings could comprehend. He saw the warp in all its complexity, perceived the nature of the Chaos Gods, and understood the true scope of the threats facing humanity. That he could endure this revelation without going mad speaks to the strength of his will and the clarity of his purpose. Perhaps most impressively, Malcador could do all of this while maintaining the facade of being just an ordinary old man. He didn't stride across battlefields wreathed in psychic fire like Magnus. He didn't crush enemies with his mind like the Emperor. He used his powers subtly, carefully, maintaining the image of a wise advisor rather than a fearsome sorcerer. This restraint was itself a form of power, allowing him to move through imperial society without triggering the fear and suspicion that more overtly powerful psykers often faced. His staff, which appeared in most depictions of him, was more than just a walking stick. It was a psychic focus, potentially a weapon, certainly a symbol of his authority. The skull that topped it was rumored to have properties that enhanced his abilities or protected him from psychic attack. Like much about Malcador, the truth of the staff remained mysterious, even to those who knew him well. Malcador also possessed what we might call political power, though calling it merely political undersells its significance. When he spoke, he did so with the Emperor's full authority. His word carried the weight of imperial law. He could command anyone in the Imperium except the Emperor himself and arguably the Primarchs, and even the Primarchs treated him with deference and respect. This wasn't psychic compulsion. It was the accumulated trust and authority of someone who had proven himself indispensable over centuries of service. His seal, the symbol of the sigillites that he carried, became the mark of the Inquisition. When Nathaniel Garrow and the other knights-errant wore that seal, they bore Malcador's authority, empowered to investigate anyone and go anywhere in pursuit of their duties. It was a mark of how much trust the Emperor placed in Malcador that he allowed him to create an organization with such sweeping powers. In the end, though, Malcador's greatest power was perhaps the most human one, the power of friendship and loyalty. He inspired devotion in those who served him not through mind control or intimidation, but through genuine respect and affection. The knights-errant followed him because they believed in him. The founders of the Inquisition carried out his vision because they trusted his judgment. The Grey Knights revere his memory because they understand what he sacrificed to create them. His relationship with the Emperor, built over centuries of partnership and mutual respect, gave him influence that no amount of psychic power could replicate. When others saw the Emperor as an unknowable force of nature, a Malcador saw a friend and colleague. When others offered blind obedience, Malcador offered honest counsel. And when the Emperor needed someone to make the ultimate sacrifice, Malcador was there without hesitation. This was Malcador's true legacy, not the institutions he founded or the powers he wielded, but the example he set. In a galaxy where might typically makes right, where superhuman warriors dominate through force of arms, where psychic power often corrupts and destroys, Malcador showed that wisdom, patience, and selfless service could be just as powerful. He proved that an old man with no gene enhancements and no combat training could be more valuable to the Imperium than entire legions of space marines. He demonstrated that loyalty didn't have to be blind, yet that you could question and challenge while still remaining faithful to a cause. He showed that administration and governance, though unglamorous, were vital to any lasting empire. He taught that sometimes the greatest heroism wasn't found on the battlefield, but in the quiet, patient work of building something that would outlast you. When the Emperor proclaimed him Malcador the hero, it wasn't for any single act of valor or martial prowess. It was for a lifetime, multiple lifetimes really, of dedicated service. It was for choosing to sit upon the golden throne, knowing it would kill him, making that choice without hesitation, because it was what humanity needed. It was for building the structures that would allow the Imperium to survive even after both he and the Emperor were gone. The 41st Millennium is a dark age, and a time of ignorance and superstition that would horrify both Malcador and the Emperor if they could see it. The Imperium they built to enlighten humanity has become its prison. The imperial truth has been replaced by religious dogma. Innovation has given way to stagnation. The bright future they envisioned is now a fading dream, lost in 10,000 years of endless war. But the Imperium endures. Against all odds, despite the constant threat of chaos, the endless war against alien species, the internal corruption and inefficiency, the Imperium continues to exist. And that continued existence, that stubborn refusal to give in to the darkness, can be traced directly back to the foundations that Malcador laid. The Administratum, for all its flaws, keeps millions of worlds coordinated. The Inquisition, though feared and often brutal, roots out threats that would destroy the Imperium from within. The Grey Knights stand ready to combat demonic incursions that would overwhelm any other force. The chaplains maintain the spiritual health of the Space Marine chapters. All of these institutions, born from Malcador's vision, continue to serve humanity. More than that, the very concept of imperial governance, of a vast bureaucratic machine that can manage an empire spanning the entire galaxy, was largely Malcador's creation. The High Lords of Terror who rule in the Emperor's absence follow structures that Malcador established. The imperial tithe that funds the Imperium's endless wars uses systems that Malcador designed. Even the complex balance between different branches of imperial authority, ensuring that no one institution can become too powerful, reflects Malcador's understanding of how to build a lasting government. If you were to somehow resurrect Malcador and show him the Imperium of the 41st Millennium, he would likely be horrified by much of what he saw. The worship of the Emperor, the suppression of knowledge, the rigid orthodoxy that crushes innovation, all of these would disturb him deeply. But he might also recognize the necessity of some of these measures. The Imperium faces threats that he and the Emperor never fully anticipated. Chaos is far more pervasive and dangerous than they realized. The alien species are far more numerous and powerful than the Great Crusade suggested. Survival, mere survival, has become the Imperium's primary achievement. And in that survival, in that grim determination to endure no matter the cost, Malcador might see a reflection of his own final act. just as he sat upon the golden throne, knowing it would kill him, because humanity needed that sacrifice, the Imperium of the 41st millennium makes terrible choices because those choices are necessary for survival. It's not the Imperium he wanted, but it's an Imperium that still exists. There's a poignant irony in Malcador's story. He dedicated his life to serving an empire that promoted the imperial truth, the idea that there were no gods, only the power of human reason and achievement. He worked to suppress religion and superstition, to build a civilization based on science and rationality. And yet, 10,000 years later, he is himself remembered as a nearly mythical figure, a hero from a golden age, his true nature obscured by legend and religious veneration. That the seal he wore, the symbol of the Sigillites, has become the mark of the Inquisition, an organization that roots out heresy in the name of the God Emperor that the real emperor would have despised. The Grey Knights that he founded are treated as holy warriors, their purity and dedication elevated to religious significance. Even his title, the Sigillite, has taken on mystical connotations that would have amused and perhaps disturbed him. But perhaps this too is fitting. Malcador understood, even if the emperor didn't always, that humanity needed more than just logic and reason to thrive. People needed stories, symbols, something to believe in that was greater than themselves. The emperor tried to ban religion entirely, and that rigidity helped enable the Horus heresy when Lorgar turned to chaos after being denied the right to worship his father. Malcador, for all his dedication to the imperial truth, was more pragmatic. He understood that beliefs and traditions, even religious ones, could be useful tools for maintaining social cohesion. He might not have approved of the ecclesiarchy and the worship of the emperor, but he would have understood why it emerged and perhaps even seen its value in holding the Imperium together through the darkest times. The real tragedy is that we'll never know what Malcador might have accomplished if he had survived the heresy. With the emperor sealed upon the golden throne, unable to speak or act, Malcador would have been perfectly positioned to guide the Imperium through its rebuilding. He had the knowledge, the experience, the respect of the surviving Primarchs and imperial leadership. He understood the emperor's vision better than anyone, except perhaps Guilliman. Would he have been able to prevent the religious transformation of the Imperium? Probably not entirely, but he might have moderated it, found a middle ground between the rigid atheism of the imperial truth and the fanaticism of the ecclesiarchy. Would he have been able to keep the Imperium from becoming so stagnant and hidebound? Perhaps, though the scale of the challenges the Imperium faced would have tested even his considerable abilities. Would he have found a way to rescue the Emperor from the Golden Throne, to heal him, or at least allow him to communicate? We can only speculate. What we do know is that Malcador's death left a void that has never been filled. But the Emperor was the vision and the power, but Malcador was the hand that turned vision into reality. Without him, the Imperium stumbled through its dark age, losing the sense of purpose and direction that had defined it during the Great Crusade. The Primarchs who survived couldn't fill the gap. They were warriors and conquerors, not administrators and diplomats. Guilliman tried and achieved more than any of his brothers, but even he couldn't replicate what Malcador had brought to the partnership with the Emperor. In the end, Malcador's story is one of selfless service, of choosing duty over glory, of making the hardest choice because it was the right choice. He could have preserved himself, could have let someone else take the Golden Throne, and could have justified staying alive by arguing that the Imperium would need his expertise in the years to come. But he didn't, because in that moment, the most important thing was buying the Emperor time to end Horus. And so he sat upon the Golden Throne and burned away, second by second, until there was nothing left but ash and memory. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the life and legacy of Malcador the Sigillite, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are so many more stories to tell from the grim darkness of the far future, so many heroes and villains and moments that shaped the Imperium we know today. Each figure in Warhammer 40,000 lore has their own tale to tell, their own impact on the galaxy. from the mightiest primarch to the humblest guardsman, or from the most powerful psyker to the most dedicated administrator, every individual who served the Imperium contributed something to the grand story of humanity's struggle for survival. Join us as we explore the depths of Warhammer 40,000 lore, one tale at a time, uncovering the secrets and stories that make this universe so compelling. The Emperor protects, but it was Malcador who made sure there was an Imperium for the Emperor to protect. His legacy lives on in every act of administration, every inquisitorial investigation, every Grey Knight who stands against the demonic. He proved that you don't need to be a god or a demigod to change the course of history. Sometimes, what the galaxy needs most is an old man with a clear vision, a patient hand, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than himself.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.